All right, so it's been a while since I've made any updates here, but I have gotten around to tearing down the X-Factory X5 and starting to rebuild it. I wanted to point out a few things about the teardown and the initial stages of the rebuild so far. So when I did the teardown, I actually tried to make a video where I did the full teardown, and I had that recording, but the camera stopped recording about halfway through. So I only have like half of it, and I figured it wouldn't be that useful to post that because it gets interrupted in a very weird spot. But nonetheless, as I was tearing down this particular X5 that I got, I saw that a lot of the stuff that was on the car wasn't that great. So for example, the shocks that were on this car were garbage. The internals might be okay, but you can see the shock body is totally beaten up. The anodizing looks like it was stripped off. There's all kinds of gunk here in the threading of the shock body. And despite that, you have this brand new shock collar that's on here. It's like you have this piece of crap shock and you're putting this brand new shock collar on here. Why? And this thing is on here so tight because of all the gunk that's in here, I can't even get this off. Really sad. So I have to put new shocks on it. I picked up these shocks. These are low-C shocks, threaded shocks, that I was going to use on this XX4 here, which has now been assigned as a parts car for this. I'll get into that in a minute. But I figured better to use them for this guy. So got to get, had to swap out the shocks. The front arms, I showed you guys these when I first got the car. These look like machined arms. I don't know what they're from, if they were some special, project or whatever. But as nice as they do look, this arm looks okay. But I think it's this arm here, where this is on the outside of the arm. It's cracked on this side. It's also cracked on this side. So I wouldn't use this because this can end up breaking. And also because these arms are pretty solid, I wouldn't want to risk breaking anything else. For example, if I ran like the standard molded plastic bulkhead. So these are going away. I will either use standard XX4 front arms or maybe the Schumacher Cat front arms because I know those seem to work as well. But okay, had to push those aside. And as I was digging deeper into the car, I found that, not the right size screws were used on all the parts. So that's a problem. Thankfully, I don't see it. None of the threads in the plastic seems to be stripped or anything. So that's a plus. Maybe one of the threads isn't so great. I think it's maybe this one here. But otherwise, it's okay. And then that's basically it when it came to the teardown. Then it was just a matter of rebuilding the car, starting with the drivetrain. So if you don't know or remember, with the X-Factory X5, the diff pulleys are custom to the X-Factory X5. It uses X-Factory diff pulleys, and the lay shaft and spur gear are also custom to the X5. Now the problem there is you can't get those anymore. So if you strip the spur gear, you can't get a replacement. And if the diff pulley wears out, you can't get a replacement. But there are alternative options here, and I wanted to use this build as an experiment for that. So starting with the diff pulleys, what's good about the X5 and why I like it is that it uses a 3mm pitch belt, a single belt that's routed inside this housing here to run to the front and rear diff pulleys. So those diff pulleys are both 3mm pitch. The XX4 rear diff uses a 3mm pitch. So even though that rear diff pulley on the XX4 is a slightly different size to the X-Factory one, maybe it's like 1 tooth smaller, it does fit in here perfectly fine. You do just have to, tension up the belt a little more. So these two slots here, these screws mount into a plate that mounts 2 rollers that this belt runs around. So you can just loosen those screws, push this back a little bit, and that'll tension up the belt for this slightly smaller diff pulley front and rear, and you're good to go. So you can most definitely take an X-Factory X5 and use the rear XX4 diff pulleys on this car, no problem. You don't need a different size belt or anything like that. It fits perfectly fine. So that's number one. Number two is dealing with the slipper setup. So again, this is the X Factory spur gear, and it's a lot like the old Traxxas style spur gears where you have these holes in here. We have to mount these little inserts into each of these holes. And this is effectively your slipper pad. And you have 6 of these that you got to mount. And I never really liked that particular arrangement for a number of reasons. These pieces can fall out, it can be kind of finicky, and also you don't have very much total area for your slipper. So if you have a higher power motor, you're not going to have as much of a tuning window for that as you would, let's say, for like a B4 style slipper pad, which has more area to it. So what I did end up doing is I bought these 100 tooth spur gears from RW Racing. They do make 2 different versions of the 100 tooth spur gear. They have a few different tooth counts, but you can get in 100 tooth. This particular one fits the B4 style slipper pads, and just make sure you watch out for getting the type of spur gear that has the appropriate inner diameter here to slot onto this lace shaft. It'll be obvious. Again, I don't remember exactly the name, but they do have a version of this where this inner hole is much larger. So just don't get that. Get the other one. And this one will fit onto here, but you do have to make a modification. And the reason for that is because of how this whole thing mounts on here. So what happens is you have on the left side here, there's a bearing that fits into this housing. Here, let me get something to point with. So this here is a bearing. You have a spacer. You have this center pulley that kind of slots in onto a drive pin, so it's kind of locked in place there. So this spacing here is fixed. And then you have your inner slipper hub, and then your spur gear and slipper pads, and your outer slipper hub, and then you have some shims, a bearing, a spacer, and then your slipper spring setup. Okay, so with the X-5 spur gear, you can see here that the width of the gear is the same. Okay, but the difference is there's an inset on both sides of the spur gear. So the part of the spur gear that actually comprises your slipper assembly is narrower on this gear than it is on this gear. When you have this gear, the whole surface here, once you mount the slipper pads on there, it's completely flush. There's no inset. That means this spur gear is effectively wider according to the, as seen by the lace shaft. So when you mount the slipper pads and the slipper hubs and you put it all on here, is basically this wider spur gear is going to push everything on this side out a little bit, and you won't be able to actually mount the lace shaft into this housing. Okay, so that's a problem. So the way you fix that is you can either use the stock X-5 slipper hub, or you can use a associated V2 slipper hub. These are actually almost the exact same size, right? The way they slot onto the lace shaft is almost exactly the same. This V2 slipper hub is actually a perfect fit for this lace shaft. But what you do is you need to remove this outer material here. And the reason for that is by removing that outer material, and I did that on the V2 slipper hub, not the original X-5 part, is if you do that and you mount that on the inside here, that allows you to basically take this whole assembly and move it in a little bit. Otherwise, with that spacer there, it's going to move this whole thing out. So you remove that, that pulls everything in, including this bearing here on the outside, so that everything fits inside this housing. And you can use shims to make up whatever slack you might have, so this doesn't move back and forth too much. What is kind of interesting about this slipper setup is that when this spring tightens down, is pushing against this spacer that pushes against this bearing that pushes against the slipper hub. So in theory, as that slipper pad wears down and you tighten this down further and further, this bearing's going to get pushed in, which means this whole thing is going to move in and out more. It's going to have more lateral slop, if you will. If you run the slipper tighter and tighter, and the slipper wears more and more and gets thinner. That's not something I've ever seen before on any other kind of slipper arrangement, where you're effectively pushing a bearing against the slipper hub here. Okay, but all right, whatever. Point being, you can mount a non-X-Factory spur gear on this with some modification to the inner slipper hub to account for the difference in width of the spur gear, and everything works perfectly fine. This mounts no problem. Everything spins fine, right? No friction, no nothing. It's, well, of course there's friction, but there's no bind, all right? And this looks like it's a little sloppy, but that's just because it doesn't have these little pieces holding down the bearings in place. Once you put that down and tighten it, it's totally fine. So, XX4 rear belt pulleys fit. New slipper arrangement fits perfectly fine. So now I have at least more accessible parts here in case something happens. I don't expect anything to happen because 3mm pitch pulleys are much more reliable than 2mm pitch, so I don't ever really expect to wear out these pulleys. And hopefully I won't strip the spur gear, but if I do, RW Racing makes them, so I can easily get replacements. The slipper pads, they're just B4 style slipper pads, easy to replace. So this whole drivetrain here is pretty much solved for. So that's good. A minor note is on the rear here I have plastic diff out drives with these little aluminum sort of, I don't know what they're called, shields or cups or whatever. This just seems to help to protect the inner edges here of the diff out drive from excessive wear. Okay, fine. I'll run that. And then on the front here, I have steel out drives instead of plastic ones. That's just what I had lying around. I think this is the diff that I pulled out of the back of that XX4. Actually, no. What I did was I pulled out both the front and rear diffs. The front diff on this had steel out drives. So I took the front out drive assembly and I slapped it onto the rear diff pulley there to make my front diff here with steel out drives. That's all I did. Okay, so this is where it is right now. I got to start assembling it with the correct size screws on everything. And I think from here on forward, it should be fairly straightforward, just assembling the suspension and so forth. That should go fine. One other thing, actually, I wanted to point out, as you can see here, I have the Moto Obscura aluminum front bulkhead for the XX4. It does mount onto the X5, although, and I think this might be more of a problem with the molding on the X5, it's not a direct fit between the XX4 and the X5 chassis. Even though both chassis use the exact same front bulkhead for the standard molded front bulkhead, the way this, oops, that cover came off. The way this bulkhead mounts onto this chassis here, there's just barely not enough room for the bulkhead to fit around this part of the plastic here on the chassis. So what I had to do was just take a Dremel and a grinding bit and just ever so slightly grind down the inside surfaces here on this bulkhead so that this can slot in nicely and fit. But once it fits fine, no problem, no worries. You just have to very slightly modify this bulkhead to make it fit. And then you're good to go. Okay, so that should be it for now. Thanks for watching.